Hi, everyone. We are going to be looking at Chapter 15, which focuses on the violent economic crimes of robbery, arson, and also looks at crimes of intimidation with stalking and cybercrime. Let's define robbery first. Robbery is the taking or attempt to take anything of value from the care, custody, or control of a person by force or violence or fear. What makes this different than burglary is there is direct contact between the offender and the victim, and there is the threat, or at least the use of force or the threat of force. The number of robberies reported to police and have declined in recent years. Strong arm robbery is more likely to result in the injury of victim. That's when there is actual physical contact. This is another one of those categories where it is a young male category of crime, and only about 4% of all arrests for all economic crimes. But it is, if you look at the total violent crime index from the Uniform Crime Report, robbery accounts for 35% of all violent crimes. Bank robbery is robbery where the location is a financial institution. And by the way, there are generally, depending on the year, about 367,000 robberies in any given year. It's only a small percentage of robberies that take place at a financial institution, probably about 2.2%. Violence is rare with bank robberies. They do have a high probability of success, at least early on. And it involves both amateurs and professionals trying to rob financial institutions. 80% are done by one person, and 80% are done by amateurs. Commercial robberies are a robbery that takes place in some type of commercial property, convenience stores, gas stations, restaurants, fast food places, any place that goods are bought and sold. Convenience stores are the top target, and gas stations are number 2. This accounts for about 15% of all robberies. Fast food chains are becoming a new favorite target. Street robbery. 42.8% of robberies take place on the streets, more common in urban areas, generally a crime of opportunity, and the motive is financial. Motive is financial in most robberies, by the way. Carjacking, which we talked about last chapter, is taking a vehicle by force. So we do have carjacking stats online in D2L if you'd like to take a look at those. So the motivation and cultural influences of robbery. The vast majority, according to Wright and Decker in 1997, most don't plan the robbery. They do get immediate gratification from that, usually financial gratification. Drug sellers and wealthy drug users used to be targets, and there's definitely a street culture that goes along with robbery as kind of a norm. But the vast majority of the motives behind almost all robberies is some type of financial gain, as we kind of talked about with burglary as well. Porter and Allison in 2006 looked at 116 cases of group robbery, and they created a typology based on interpersonal behaviors on how robbers treat their victims, kind of themes, if you will. So they came up with these different groups. Dominance, the method preferred by most professional robbers, is to completely dominate the situation and the victim. Submission, robbers not forceful enough and victim struggles and gets away, or the robbers flee. It's typically an unsuccessful robbery. Cooperation, the offender manipulates victims to get them to cooperate and hand over their property, open the safe, things like that, give them their purse. There's usually a threat of force to get them to cooperate. And hostility, the offender is hostile and aggressive and even violent from the onset, often initiates aggressive response from victim, and that can end up in, more injuries if the victim is hostile to a hostile offender. Commercial robberies tend to have a cooperation theme, and personal robberies, like on those street robberies we were talking about, tend to have a hostile theme. All right, cybercrime is a fairly recent phenomenon. If you look at the whole history of the criminal justice system here in the United States, really the last 20 years, it's any illegal activity that involves some type of computer system. Computer crimes are unauthorized access, data theft, stealing software, looking at unauthorized access, hacking, virus generation, sending out emails with viruses attached to get unauthorized access to somebody's home computer and then take the computer over it. There are phishing, spoofing scams through email. There's also involves things like illegal gambling as well. It can also involve cloning information, cloning to get access to information. Psychological characteristics of cybercrimes. Most people that engage in cybercrimes have pretty good computer technical skills, and they're able to kind of keep in front of police technology. They of course use those techniques of neutralization, especially when they are targeting like a financial institution, like Target a few years ago. A lot of the credit card information of customers was stolen, and you can in your mind say, well, Target's a big corporation, they're going to pay everybody back, and things like that. Stalking. This is a course of conduct directed at a specific person that involves repeated physical or unwanted proximity, non-consensual communication, or verbal or written, and can involve implied threats. So the definition will vary from state to state. California was the first state to pass anti-stalking laws in 1990 after an actress named Rebecca Schaefer was killed by a stalker. Tennessee laws, Georgia laws will all be very different. Most of you live in Georgia. I live in Tennessee, so they're all very different. In 2006, it was estimated that 3.4 million people under the age of persons 18 or older were victims of stalking. One study found that 8% of women and 2% of men had been stalked at some point in their life. But that is a lot of people every year who are victims of some type of stalking. Rarely causes physical harm. It's mostly emotional harm and feeling like your safety is at risk. But victims can have psychological trauma even if there is no physical trauma, including anxiety, depression. Some have to change their phone number. They have to change their address. They have to move. They have to change it can get pretty bad where people have to move, change jobs, change their hair color, things like that. Now, there are a couple of categories and typologies that have been created on stalking. This particular typology has 4 categories. The first is simple obsession. 60% of cases usually fall under this particular category. It's usually an extension of a previous or failed relationship with domestic violence, psychological abuse, control, and power as the motivation. It can be the most dangerous, particularly if the stalker has the kind of mentality of, if I can't have you, no one will. Love obsession. This is a casual acquaintance or it can even be complete strangers. Stalkers tend to have low self-esteem and obsess over victim, seek out a love relationship with an object of their obsession. Erotomania. Stalker usually has severe mental health issues, often delusional, and they tend to stalk public figures. Statistically, this type of stalker is rare. And then we have the vengeance, where they are not seeking a relationship, but they are seeking to cause a certain response from the victim. And usually that response is some type of fear, and it's usually out of some perceived injustice or a need for revenge against the victim. Cyberstalking is using the internet and other forms of electronic communication to do everything that we just talked about, unwanted advances in communication towards another. Cyber harassment is threatening or harassing email messages, instant messages, blog entries, websites, etc., dedicated to tormenting an individual. Cyber stalking is, again, a fairly recent phenomena, and we have more of it now that we have a lot of our personal information online. So we see a lot of cyber stalking through not just traditional things like email, but now with text messaging and on social media sites. And there's all different types of cyber stalking and cyber harassment that can be done using those platforms. Cyberbullying is the same, using all of those types of electronic media, text messaging, emails, posting on social media sites, creating false social media sites. And it makes bullying even more scary, because the bullies can now hide behind the anonymity of the internet. Usually it's short duration, but the bully feels the need for power and control, and it can have really horrific consequences. There's been a lot of cases of cyberbullying that, have ended in the victims committing suicide or hurting themselves, because, it's really horrific to have somebody post things about you on social media sites, especially for teenagers. So this can be really horrific. As of January in 2015, 49 states had enacted bullying prevention legislations, and that included cyberbullying. The Megan Meyer Cyberbullying Prevention Act of 2009 amends the federal crime code to impose criminal penalties on anyone who transmit a communication intended to coerce, intimidate, or harass, cause emotional distress to another person using any type of electronic means. Hostage-taking offenses. Hostage-taking is when one person is held against their will. The goal is typically material gain or freedom. So holding somebody against their will, usually in like a family setting where you hold somebody hostage and barricade yourself in house. It could be through robberies of a property, holding somebody hostage to get freedom. But there's usually some type of financial gain that is wanted, or freedom. So there's instrumental, and then there's also expressive, where the goal is psychological, trying to take some type of control, show power, like a husband taking his wife and kids hostage. The FBI in 1970 created 4 categories of hostage takers: terrorist, prisoners, criminals, and mentally disordered. Mentally disordered is the largest category, with 50% of all cases falling under that particular category, according to the FBI. Guidelines for hostage negotiation. Now, this is a place where psychologists can really help in terms of training law enforcement. The guidelines and the goals, of course, for working with hostage takers is to stabilize and contain the situation so that nobody will get hurt. They usually have, most law enforcement agencies have specialized police officers who have been trained by psychologists for negotiating with hostage takers. You want to take your time, allow the subject to speak. It's more important to be a good listener than a good talker. Don't offer the subject anything. Avoid direct, frequent attention to the victims. Do not call them hostages. Be as honest as possible, and try to avoid tricks. Never dismiss any request as trivial. Never say no. Never set a deadline. Try not to accept a deadline, and do not make alternative suggestions. These are some of the guidelines that seem to reduce the risk that the victims will be hurt. Don't introduce outsiders, non-law enforcement, into the negotiation process. That's generally why they have one person who has been trained who will do the negotiations. They'll call that person in, and that person will be the only person to make a connection with the hostage taker and to be the only person that talks to them. Do not allow any exchange of hostages, especially do not exchange a negotiator for a hostage. Now, every situation is going to be different, of course, and everybody's going to have to use their personal experience and training to determine, what is going to work best. But those are some of the basic guidelines that have been enacted for working with hostage takers. It's an interesting syndrome called, and you've probably heard of this, called Stockholm syndrome. It was based on a case in 1973 where a female hostage kind of fell in love with her abductor and eventually married him. So it's an attraction to or an identification with the abductor. It's highly unlikely, but it has happened. The hostage taker, for this to take place, and the victim must be together for a long period of time. The hostage must be in direct social contact during the incident, and the hostage taker must treat the hostages kindly. There has been, you may have heard or may not have heard of Patty Hearst, who was taken hostage back in the 1970s, I believe. And there was a lot of talk, and she was eventually arrested, by the way. She ended up robbing banks with her hostage takers. And there's a lot of talk about her developing Stockholm syndrome, and that's why she ended up doing what she did. But she was put on trial for her crimes. Really interesting syndrome. Rules for hostages to follow. Survivors, hostage returns to live a healthy, productive life after incident. Succumbers did not survive ordeal and or suffer severe emotional trauma after incident. And it really just kind of depends on the individual situation, how much violence was involved, how the hostages were treated, how long they were held captive, and your individual coping skills for dealing with something like that. All right, arson is any willful or malicious burning or attempt to burn with or without the intent to defraud a dwelling, house, public building, motor vehicle, aircraft, personal property, or another person. The Uniform Crime Report only reports those which have been willfully or maliciously set. In 2009, there were 210,000 fires that were set intentionally. 13% of all fires reported to the fire department were the result of arson, the fires being set intentionally. In 2010, 41% of the arsons were set by juveniles, 24% were under the age of 18. This tends to be a young person category of crime. And again, it tends to be male, with 75 to 85% of all arsons being done by males. Most actually go undetected or unreported or unsolved. We do have because of this, we have, again, that a large dark figure of crime, because we only have the crimes that are actually reported to the police. The incidence and prevalence of arson. Many communities in the United States are currently experiencing a significant increase in serial arson-related fires. The U.S. Fire Administration follows arsons and tries to keep statistics on how many arsons are set every year. Again, young males account for the vast majority of people who are arrested for arsons, and again, most go undetected, unreported, or unsolved. Now, there's an interesting thing about fires, and that is children tend to have kind of a normal interest in fires. It's kind of part of development. So Gaynor in 1996 came up with a 3-stage development theory. Number 1, fire interest. This is common in almost all children between the ages of 5 and 7. It's just kind of an interest in fire. Fire play between the ages of 5 and 9, where kids experiment with fire setting, playing with matches, playing with lighters. And then 3, fire setting. By 10, most kids have learned the dangers of fire and stop, and that kind of fascination is gone. But a small percentage will persist with fire setting past the age of 10, and those are the ones that we worry about. So before age 10, fire interest and fire play is kind of a normal thing, but after age 10, it can be problematic. Those who do engage in fire setting after the age of 10 tend to have poor social skills, impulse control issues, ADD, ADHD, conduct disorder, and they also tend to engage in other antisocial and delinquent behavior. So again, past 10 seems to be problematic. Persistent and repetitive fire setting among adults. So when we see fire setting past the age 10 and moving into adults, there tends to be different motivations. And remember how I talked about with property crimes, there's not a lot of psychology behind those, except for arson. So arson can have some psychology behind it. So setting a fire for adults is often precipitated by events that really kind of trigger their feelings of self-esteem, sadness, depression. Arson is usually precipitated by some type of life event that kind of triggers that. Research suggests that repeat arsonists have a wide variety of mental health issues. They come from troubled backgrounds. A lot of them have been abused. Some were abused with fire as a child. or burned as children. A lot of arsonists will actually stay at the scene and watch. Most set fires alone and in secret. The motivation can vary, while some are for psychological reasons, like, self-esteem, sadness, depression, feeling like you want to be in control. Attention is another one. But there are other people that set fires just for financial reasons, for destroying evidence, destroying property for insurance purposes, things like that, getting back at other people. We don't have a lot of information on female arsonists. They tend to be older, African-American, unmarried, uneducated, with a history of alcohol and drug abuse. And the motivation for females who set fires tends to be revenge. And they tend to be, again, a little older, and that is 30 plus, where males tend to be younger. With juveniles who set crime, the motivation tends to be revenge, attention, getting back at authority figures, gaining status on a dare, thrill, excitement. And then again, some can have those psychological problems that we talked about. Behavioral typologies and trajectories. This was created by Cantor and Fritzen in 1998, and it's based on behavior patterns and crime scene actions of the offender. So this is what we see in what we would gather from both the offender and the crime scene. Number one, expressive person pattern. More common, they tend to have mental illnesses, and their fire setting is either a cry for help or a need for attention. Expressive object serial fire setters are fascinated with fire. The goal is not to injure or harm or destroy property, but they just are kind of fascinated by fire. So they set fires to watch them burn. They tend to burn trash and abandoned buildings. They don't really target particular people or organizations. Instrumental person targeted arson. This is typically where a person or an organization is targeted, either as revenge or against somebody, typically a person who's in a position of authority, school teacher, family, boss, things like that. And then instrumental object, most often associated with young offenders, usually linked with some other type of crime like burglary, and there's usually a motivation of financial gain with instrumental object. All right, psychological disorders that are associated with arson. You've probably heard of pyromania. This is something that's listed in the DSM, and it is where somebody really has a kind of obsession and or fascination with fire. They tend to have impulse control issues. They tend to be young. They tend to be male. And a small percentage of arsons are set by somebody that is an actual pyromania. All right, so pretty simple chapter again, since we're talking about crimes that, there are definitely psychological factors behind stalking and fire setting, but a lot of the other things that we talked about, it's really kind of just financial motivation. If you have any questions about anything in this chapter, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.